Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fifth conversation in the Summer Speaker Series brought to you by the AEI Academic Programs Department. My name's Emma Costa. I'm an Academic Programs Associate here at AEI, and I'm really excited to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, Swiping Left and Right, Dating in the Trump Era. Before getting started, I do want to remind you all that we'll be hosting these conversations on Wednesdays, usually at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time throughout July. So keep an eye out on your inbox for future invitations, and be sure to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at AEI for Students to check out our full lineup for the month of July. The last thing I'll mention is that if you attend 3 or more of these Summer Speaker Series webinars, you'll be automatically entered into a t-shirt giveaway. You can check out the design for that t-shirt on Instagram, so stay tuned throughout the summer for your chance to win. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben Ramey, the chair of AEI's Executive Council at Michigan State University. The Executive Council program consists of over 100 AEI on-campus chapters where students get to host events with public policy scholars from all over the country. If you're interested in learning more, we'll be posting a link to our information page for the Executive Council in the chat, so be sure to check that out. The MSU Council is going to be helping us out with today's webinar, and Ben is going to be moderating the conversation. So I will recuse myself, and Ben, I will turn it over to you. You can take it away.
Thanks, Emma. The format for today is pretty straightforward. Dr. Cox and I will have a conversation for around 20 minutes, and then I'll turn it to your questions. So if you have any questions for Dr. Cox throughout the webinar, please type in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the last 10 minutes of our session. With all that being said, I'm excited to introduce Daniel Cox, a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Cox, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Okay, so let's get on to our first question. So your report, Partisan Attachment, How Politics is Changing Dating and Relationships in the Trump Era, explores how the approval of Trump and his presidency can play a huge role in the desirability of an individual. You examined several policies that generally see fierce political debate, but no policy even comes close to the Trump approval and disapproval variable. Why do you think an individual's opinion of the Trump presidency plays such a huge role in the individual desirability?
Yeah, so this was a study we conducted back in February of this year. It was a national study based on American adults, 18 and up. And one of the goals was to really get a sense of how political polarization, something that we know has been on the increase over the last few decades, was impacting the way Americans are living their lives. So how is it operational on the ground? And particularly, we were interested in looking at dating and romantic relationships. So how has sort of politics sort of seeped into some of our dating decisions? And this was informed by a little bit of pop culture too. There have been a number of reports looking at data from places like OkCupid and Tinder that the preliminary evidence suggested that people were assigning more value or more importance to political labels than in the past. So we wanted to get at that same idea with a representative study. So we did that. And I think to answer your question, one of the things that I think was really interesting and perhaps not totally surprising was that people, when they think about Trump, it's not really about politics in terms of the objections. And I will actually let people speak for themselves on this, because we, over the course of doing the study, we garnered some media coverage, and one story in the Washington Post, they featured on their Facebook page, and they had over 2,000 comments to the story of people basically providing their opinion and giving some detailed answers. And so I'm just going to read a couple because I think they're pretty telling and helps to sort of get to the bottom of this. So one woman named Lisa said this to the question about why she would not date a Trump supporter. And she says, supporting Trump has nothing to do with political beliefs. It is much deeper, and it speaks to a person's integrity, morality, and character. It is about basic human decency, core ethics, belief in facts and truth, social justice, basic human rights, and the rule of law. It's obviously a lot of things in there. It is also, she says, fundamental to attempt to quantify as, it says, too fundamental to attempt to quantify as a partisan political issue. Another respondent, her name's Beth, she says, it's not even about Trump's politics. That's a proxy for other dimensions of their beliefs. having dated a couple of Trump supporters in the past, I can say that we had very little of substance in common. And these differences aren't about supporting Trump or not. They're about having drastically different values. But they do correlate pretty well with disapproval of Trump, so that's a good shortcut for her. And finally, there's a respondent named Matt. He says, under normal circumstances, I'd say breaking relationships over political differences is childish and petty. Unfortunately, these are not normal circumstances. My differences with Trump are not political, but ethical. I won't associate with anyone who believes it is okay to treat people with less power the way that he does. And I think if you look at the way even former Trump supporters are talking about him, there was an article in the Upshot today in the New York Times that asked people in their own words to talk about why they were no longer supporting him. And a lot of it's not about his politics, it's about his personality, how he approaches his job as president, how he treats people. This is a really common theme that came up again and again. And I think that more than anything else, and it came to light, I think, also during in his reaction to the protests. And I think that's part of what's going on there. So people aren't thinking about how does Trump view economic policy or trade policy. It's about who he is fundamentally. And I think that's why it has such a visceral and strong response from folks.
Excuse me. Going on to the second question, kind of pulling back a little bit, how have politics impacted the dating world over the decades? Has the percentage of people who find it impossible or difficult to date someone with different political views changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of great evidence on this one way or the other. It's one of the reasons that we wanted to look at this. But in part, we know that it actually, in the past, it wasn't that easy to date or just to find folks that shared your political affinities. Before the internet, your basically opportunities to meet people were physical locations, going to a bar, at your church or congregation, through family members or friends, through school. Those were the ways that you met people, and geography played a pretty big role. With the arrival of the internet, one of the things that has completely changed is we are much better able to sort of filter out things we don't like, and to highlight things that are important to us, and it can run the gamut. Now, most of the online dating websites and platforms actually allow you to provide a lot of detail about your interests and your hobbies and your values. And in fact, a lot of the platforms actually added more political issues in light of sort of the concerns and interests of their members. And so I think that avails people the opportunity to really pinpoint and with a lot of precision the politics that matters to them. So I think that's new, and I think that is part of what's encouraging people to make politics a priority, is that they actually have the ability to do so.
Mm-hmm. See, that actually leads into one of my next questions, which is, how does implementing your political views into your dating profile affect your chances of scoring a date? Are there specific political statements that hurt your chances disproportionately? Would you recommend leaving the political statements out of your dating profile, or do they actually serve a purpose?
I think they absolutely serve a purpose. It just may not, run along lines that you might hope. And this we know from our data plus other data out there is that by and large, women are more likely than men to have or to make political symmetry or homophily a sort of more important issue for them. Men are much less likely to say that that's a priority. And we see that among Republican women and Democratic women is true. In our survey, we found that, other than Trump, one of the biggest deal-breaking issues is the issue of abortion. And I think that makes a lot of sense. In addition to it being just a generally controversial issue, it's also one that is tightly bound to views about morality and religion, things that are often not easily sort of compromised over. We also know from other surveys that I've done in the past that there's a number of Americans who believe that abortion is simply a black and white issue, and this is a belief that's particularly held on the wing. So people who say it should be legal in all cases or illegal in all cases. So people that sort of either extreme basically are far more likely to say that this is a black and white issue and not something that can be easily compromised over. And you think a lot of those sort of cultural questions lend themselves to that, right? There's an either and or. When you think about economic policy or trade policy, it's much harder to have like a deal-breaking stance. Like, you know, what's your deal-breaking position on, trade with China? I mean, it's a lot more difficult, and I think a lot more difficult to get it sort of upset about. So I think that is something that I would certainly say. I would also say if politics is important to you, you should absolutely include it in your profile. I mean, you know, why wouldn't you? Any other sort of hobby or you know, important part of your background or history is something that if you put that in your profile, you should put your politics too. And so I think, you know, trying to hide that, I mean, it's going to come out in the first few dates. And in fact, some of the people that we interviewed over the course of doing the study, we found that they basically said, yeah, there's no point of hiding. This is mostly Democratic women who said this. So there's no point of hiding your political affiliation, because I'm going to find out eventually, and it's going to, you know, you're going to end up wasting my time and your time. And in fact, I in some of the interviews that I did, some of the women I talked to were had sort of a heightened antennae up to sort of identify people who were closet conservatives, right? So they're identifying as moderate or middle of the road in their profile, and they're like, no, that's you're conservative, just not wanting to say it.
So the next question is, how common are bipartisan couples? Is the success rate of bipartisan relationships lower than same-party relationships?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex question for sure. The best academic literature suggests that, you know, over the 30 or 40-year period, which most of these studies have looked, there's been an increase in political homophily among married couples. So people who are newlywed tend to be more likely to be same party now than back in the early 70s, which I think was when one of the studies looked at. And there's been a pretty significant shift. I think in that study, it was about half of couples had the same sort of political identity, and now it's 3/4. And so I think there's some amount of prioritizing politics. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's also been much easier for us to do that than in the past as well. And the third reason, which I didn't mention, is that there's a thing called social identity congruence that's occurring. And there's a great book by Liliana Mason that I would recommend you all read if you're interested in this topic. And she basically found that other identities that are not political, so your race and ethnicity, religion, class, are becoming more tightly correlated with our political identity. So I could be, you know, someone who's like, I want to date someone who's an atheist and has an advanced degree. Well, by and large, those people are largely Democrats or largely liberals. So if that's my priorities, I could not even mention politics in my profile. But if that's the type of person I'm looking for, chances are they're going to be a Democrat. Conversely, if I wanted to date someone who's, you know, lives in a rural area and is very religious, they're more likely to be Republican and conservative. So like there's not any reason there should be a correlation between those different types of identities, but that's sort of what's going on. And so that's a third reason why some increase of political homophily might be occurring.
Looking at all those variables that you just said, do you think location plays a role in how politics affects relationships? So for example, would dating someone with different political views be more or less of a deal breaker for someone in DC versus, let's say, like Lincoln, Nebraska?
It depends. There's certainly people in Lincoln, Nebraska that care a lot about politics, but I think in DC, because so much of the sort of culture here is focused on politics, and so many of the jobs revolve around politics, it can be difficult to avoid. And so I think, it can be hard to right, if you work in politics and the first question that anyone in DC invariably asks you is, what do you do? It can be hard to sidestep that, even if you wanted to, than it would be in a place, like Miami or Nebraska or almost anywhere else.
Okay. So another example question is, looking at the variables at play, I'm curious if there are drastic changes to values if you focus on a specific age group. For example, younger generations are very concerned about climate change. Would it be realistic to say that if you tested a sample size of 20-year-olds and 50-year-olds, the 20-year-olds have a larger percentage of individuals who find it impossible or somewhat difficult to date someone with different view on climate change than them.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's going on here? There are particular issues, and I think climate change is a good example, and LGBT equality is a good one, where there's just increasing consensus. In fact, among people under the age of 30, there's not much of a debate on either of those questions. And if you look at Republicans and Democrats under the age of 30, again, there's a lot more agreement than there are among Democrats and Republicans age 65 and older. And in the past few weeks, actually, we're seeing the same thing happen on racial inequality as well, where younger people in particular are sort of converging in their opinion about how important an issue is this. And so I think that certainly lends some hope, right? So if we're thinking about ways that Democrats and Republicans can come together, for me, as someone who looks at this stuff and we focus so much on the disagreements and the dissonance in places where Americans just can't get along. I mean, it's kind of uplifting to see places where there's actually a significant consensus emerging on some of these issues.
So one of my final questions before we turn to viewer questions is, generally speaking, beyond the dating world, is the United States more polarized than it was a decade or two ago, or are we just more aware of it today because of social media?
Yeah, this is a thorny question, and I'll touch on a few things because we could talk about this for an hour at least. Mm-hmm. So a couple things. When we talk about polarization, there's polarization at the elite level. So that's legislators primarily in the House, but also in the Senate. And the best available research suggests that beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, we saw a really significant uptick in political polarization among elected members of Congress. And that was measured a couple different ways. One was they used DW nominate scores, which basically look at your voting record and determine whether the legislation is conservative or liberal, and sort of assign you a score based on that. And they found that both Republicans and Democrats were sort of moving further to the polls, but doing so asymmetrically. So Republicans were moving much more in a conservative direction than Democrats were in a liberal direction, at least over the past 30 or 40 years. There's some sense that might be changing now, with Democrats moving a little bit more to the left in recent years. But for the at least the 40-year, 45-year period that most scholars have looked at, it's Republicans who have moved much further. The other way they measured it was looking at political moderates. Both parties at one time had a plurality, if not a majority, of members that were politically moderate. And what happened over the last 20 to 30 years is that both parties evacuated, whether through primaries or just retirements, their moderate members basically left. And so we have a much more polarized Congress now than in the past. There's also a sort of parallel track of work that has looked at the same kind of political polarization occurring among the mass public. And, by and large, the verdict's still out on how much, or if this is even occurring at all. There's some good work by the Pew Research Center that shows some amount of political polarization occurring. They look back to the mid-90s, and they have some really great graphics to show that. But some of the scholarship suggests that this is only occurring among people who are highly engaged. So the people who are actually polarized are people who care a lot and pay a lot of attention to politics. The other thing that's happening, and this is happening at the mass level, is affective polarization. And what I mean by that is that simply Democrats and Republicans don't like each other much anymore. So the amount of disaffection for the opposing party is higher now than it's ever been, and it can take the shape of some pretty significant sort of social choices and behavior. So there's a question that was asked, I think like 30 or 40 years ago, about how upset would you be if a member of your household, may have been son or daughter, married someone of the opposite party. And back then, I think it was like 10% of the public that said this would bother them. More recently, I think in the last couple of years, this question was re-asked, and nearly half of Democrats now said that would bother them whether their child married a Republican, and more than a third of Republicans said the same. The other thing, the question I think that illuminates this a little bit is a question whether Republican policies and Democratic policies are just wrong or dangerous. And an increasing number of partisans now believe that it's not just that the opposing party has the wrong ideas, it's the ideas that are actually dangerous. So again, like, this is all about how you feel about the other party, and it's particularly dangerous because it can lead us to upend democratic norms. So if we think that the parties represent something that is dangerous and we really dislike them, we're much more inclined to sort of say, no, maybe we don't want them speaking at our event. Maybe we don't want them to be allowed to have, put their ideas, featured in a news story or an op-ed or a book. And it's related to the thing I talked to you about I mentioned earlier about sort of the social realignments. So now that Democrats and Republicans not just have different ideas about policy, that they're different types of people along lines of class and race and religion, it's much easier to demonize folks who have little or no similarity to you at all. And I'll give you an example of how this has been changing. So in 1992, it was, I think, 80 to 85% of George H.W. Bush, his voting coalition was white Christian. For Bill Clinton, his opponent in 92, roughly, I think, 60% of his coalition was white Christian. So both the Democratic coalition and the Republican coalition were largely made up of white Christians. If you look at Hillary Clinton's coalition in 2016, only 37% were white Christian. Her coalition was made up the majority of it of people who weren't, whereas the Republican coalition for Trump, again, didn't really differ much from George H.W. Bush's several decades earlier. So what's happened is the Democratic Party has become much more racially, ethnically, religiously diverse, and the Republican coalition has largely stayed the same. And now they're the coalitions are very, very different. And I think that can engender both fear and distrust, and it's a huge problem. And I think one that scholars of political polarization are starting to grapple with.
Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. So now we're going to go on to a few viewer questions. So one of our first ones is from Derek, who says, going beyond dating, are there helpful predictors for marital stability between individuals who maintain opposite political affiliation or policy views? What key factors seem to be reoccurring among stable Democrat or Republican marriages?
Yeah, I've actually gotten this question before in person, and I've also gotten it with people asking about dating across lines of race, ethnicity, and religion. I had actually a recent email from a young woman who said her significant other was different politically, was of different race and different religion, and hats off to them. That is a really sort of difficult challenge. And I think one of the reasons that it is despite the fact that when it comes to interracial and interreligious dating, the public at large and young people in particular are much more accepting and tolerant than they were in the past. There still isn't a lot of support structures, particularly institutional, to help that couple out and to navigate some of those challenges, cultural and other. And so I think it's a huge problem. When I talk to folks about the fact that interreligious dating is on the increase and interreligious marriages are rising too, which makes sense given that the religious diversity in the U.S. is increasing. One of the things that I often talk about is the fact that when people get married from different religious backgrounds and they have kids, what they end up doing is raising atheists, because there isn't the structure, there isn't the institutional support. There's only a handful of interfaith organizations in the U.S. And so if you live in an area where there's simply not that kind of support, it becomes much more difficult to navigate these issues. And I think that's one way people navigate is not to talk about it. And so that's why you see a lot of folks sort of, if their goal is maintenance of the relationship, despite the fact that their politics or their religion, their racial identity are really important to them, they might try to downplay some of those cultural or political differences in order to sort of retain marital stability and satisfaction. These are older studies now, but some have found that people with dissimilar backgrounds tend to have lower levels of marital satisfaction than people with similar backgrounds. But again, I think a lot of that has to do with sort of societal acceptance as well. So people not facing, public recrimination or criticism from not only society, but family members as well. And I think that is something that is changing, that people are finding more familial support, even if they aren't finding institutional support. When it comes to people who have dissimilar political beliefs, there's not much out there to help with that. And I think, particularly now with Trump being so polarizing, and again, I think it goes beyond politics. From the folks I've talked to, that Trump is held up as a someone who does not, for people who don't like him, as someone who simply does not accord people basic respect and decency. And I think that is for many just a deal breaker, because when you think about dating someone, like what you want more than anything is someone who's nice to you and treats you well. And so I think that's sort of wrapped up in sort of the politics around Trump.
So my next question is from Sabrina Garland. She says, do you have anonymous examples that you can share of successful relationships between younger people of opposing political parties, and what made them work?
I do not. This is a sort of research topic, an ongoing interest of mine, and I think an incredibly important research topic. And again, we're talking about politics here, but I think given how diverse your generation is, trying to understand how people are navigating these things, and I'm just a researcher, so but I think ultimately helping people navigate them is incredibly important, but takes me well outside my comfort zone and area of expertise. I do think that one of the chief coping strategies is to downplay political differences. So finding areas of agreement, stepping below political issues to find whether there's values, like a sort of similar political beliefs and values that sort of are above or below sort of the political issues. And I think another challenge, and I think that this is something that we're also looking forward to studying in the near future, is that I think we're seeing a rise of political homogeneity in people's social networks. So I did a study back in 2013 that looked at levels of homogeneity among your sort of closest sort of inner circle. And Americans are still incredibly segregated by race, ethnicity, religion, by class. And I think increasingly that's what's happening is people are becoming more socially segregated by politics too. And it's incredibly unfortunate. So there's one good thing and there's one bad thing about being in a sort of politically similar couple or people with the same political beliefs. One is that politically similar couples tend to be more politically engaged. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to participate. They're more likely to pay attention to the news. The downside of political homophily in marriages and couples is that those type of folks also tend to be more extreme in their views. So it sort of cuts against sort of the benefit of being more engaged. So yeah, I mean, I don't have any direct advice. I mean, everyone's situation is so different, but I do think that, it's something that your generation in particular is going to have to wrestle with. And I think, it starts with just listening and being open and finding areas of commonality, even if you may not come to a place where you actually agree on the particular issue. The other thing that I will say that there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope in social science research is that studies of married couples have found that people with dissimilar political attitudes initially tend to converge later on. And I think that comes with, ideally, if you respect and trust your spouse or your partner, over time, you'll be able to sort of see their point of view on maybe a variety of political issues where you didn't see eye to eye initially.
So I was going to try to fit one more question in, but it is 1:30. So I think that's all the time we have for today's conversation. Dr. Cox, thank you so very much for joining us. And thanks to all of you out there tuning in. We hope you can join us again next week, Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll be speaking with AEI's Michael Beckley on the potential challenges to future rise of China. So keep an eye out for the invitation tomorrow, and check out our full July lineup on our Facebook or Instagram at AEI for Students. And lastly, if you have undergraduate friends who are interested in these types of conversations, invite them to sign up for our student network to receive invitations to the summer speaker series and learn more about the different opportunities that AEI has for students. Thank you all again for joining, and we'll see you again next week.